The blizzard roared like a beast unleashed from a nightmare, slicing through the valley with relentless fury. Emily staggered through the deepening snow, every step an agony of frozen limbs and waning hope. Against her chest, wrapped desperately in tattered woolen shawls, her infant son whimpered softly. His cries, once strong, now grew fainter, drowned beneath the wind's sinister howls. She stumbled, falling heavily onto her knees in the powdery snow. The cold burned through her threadbare dress, stabbing needles into her flesh. Emily pushed herself upright, panting, forcing her trembling body forward. Her vision blurred as swirling flakes danced around her, mocking her attempted escape. The world seemed reduced to shades of white and shadows, cruelly indifferent to her suffering. Her mind raced, tormented by fragmented memories of the last few brutal hours. The elders of Briar Creek had gathered solemnly in the modest wooden church. Faces stern, hearts hardened by fear and suspicion. They accused her husband Jonathan of deserting their settlement, labeling Emily and her child as burdens to the struggling community. In their merciless judgment, they saw fit to cast her out into the wilderness, alone and vulnerable, to face whatever fate awaited her. A wave of sorrow crashed upon her, bitter as gall. Jonathan had vanished months before, on a hunting trip from which he never returned. Whispers swirled behind Emily's back, hinting at cowardice or betrayal, but she knew him. His gentle voice, his reassuring touch, the soft laughter that lingered in the rooms he once filled with warmth. He would never willingly abandon her or their precious child. Something terrible must have happened, something she dared not imagine. Emily pressed on, driven by the primal force of motherhood. Her baby, tiny, defenseless, depended solely on her strength, her willpower. The harshness of the wilderness was unforgiving, the air bitterly frigid. The only shelter lay miles away, beyond hills cloaked in shadows and ice. Darkness loomed closer, carrying with it the promise of predators, wolves whose distant howls grew more frequent and more insistent. She scanned desperately for any semblance of shelter, eyes straining through the snowfall. Nothing appeared. The landscape was barren, hostile, endless white emptiness. Her pulse thundered in her ears, despair gripping her heart like a vice. She could feel her baby weakening, his tiny frame shaking with chill, his soft whimpers becoming weaker, more infrequent. "I won't let you die," Emily whispered fiercely into wind, voice choked with tears. "Please, hold on." Exhaustion blurred the line between consciousness and oblivion. Emily pushed onward until her legs betrayed her, collapsing beneath her weight once more. With trembling hands, she tried to shield her baby from the blinding snow. Her fingers, numb and stiff, failed to secure the wrappings. Panic rose sharply in her chest. Suddenly, a violent gust slammed against her frail body, stealing her breath, sending her sprawling onto the frozen earth. The world spun, darkness clawing at her vision. Desperation surged as she crawled feebly toward a rocky outcrop that appeared hazily through swirling snowflakes. With her last reserves of strength, she curled around her son, shielding him with her own freezing body. "Please, someone," she murmured faintly, voice carried away by the wind's cruel laughter. The sky darkened swiftly, an inky curtain falling over the valley. The temperature plunged further, biting deeper, relentless in its cruelty. Emily's thoughts drifted to happier times. Warm summer afternoons beneath shady trees, Jonathan's laughter echoing gently, his eyes filled with tender devotion. Those memories seemed impossibly distant, cruelly out of reach. The infant's cries had stopped entirely now, replaced by silence more terrible than any sound. Emily's heart thundered in panic, terror eclipsing her pain. She held her breath, tears freezing upon her cheeks, and pressed her ear desperately against the child's tiny chest. Relief flooded through her, faint but clear. The fragile heartbeat persisted, yet she knew their survival now hung by a thread. Then, through the furious storm, another sound pierced her senses, harsh and predatory. Wolves close now, their guttural growls signaling hunger and imminent danger. Her blood froze, heart hammering violently in her ribs. She had no strength left to flee, nowhere to hide. Terror sank its claws deep into her soul. Shapes moved stealthily at the edge of her vision, shadowy and sinister. The pack encircled her, their eyes glowing with primal menace, teeth bared in hungry anticipation. Emily summoned every ounce of strength left in her weary bones and curled protectively tighter around her baby, defiant despite hopelessness. A low growl emerged from the darkness, resonating deeply. Emily closed her eyes, awaiting the painful end. Yet, suddenly, a sharp yelp erupted into chaos. Another sound, swift footsteps, strangely muffled, approached with surprising speed. A powerful voice, fierce and commanding, shouted in an unfamiliar tongue. Emily's eyes fluttered open, her vision blurred by fatigue. She glimpsed a tall, powerful figure emerging to blinding snow, silhouetted against moonlit haze. Swift movements, graceful yet lethal, scattered the wolves. Emily stared, heart pounding wildly, disbelief mingling with awe. Was this salvation, or another, darker fate? The stranger knelt close, face partially hidden beneath heavy furs, dark eyes intense yet strangely kind. He reached out gently, cautiously, assessing the woman and child before him. Emily flinched instinctively, conditioned by betrayal, yet something in his quiet manner eased her fear. "Please," she whispered weakly, voice trembling with vulnerability. Without hesitation, he removed a thick hide cloak from his shoulders, wrapping around Emily and her infant with deliberate care. His eyes softened, a silent promise of protection and warmth. "I will not harm you," he said gently, voice low and soothing, words accented yet clear. "You must trust me." Exhausted beyond comprehension, warmth enveloped Emily at last. Kindness offered by an unlikely savior. Her consciousness faded, peaceful at last, heart lifted by unexpected hope. Who was this stranger whose arrival defied fate itself? Sleep overcame her, leaving only unanswered questions swirling like the snow, carrying the promise of survival, redemption, and the mysterious stranger's gentle whisper echoing softly into darkness. "Rest now, you are safe." When Emily awoke, the first thing she noticed was the warmth. It wrapped around her like a heavy cloak, soft and suffocating in its embrace. The storm's rage had softened, leaving the air still and heavy. The cold that gnawed at her bones was now a distant memory, replaced by a heat that seemed foreign and almost dreamlike. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking away the haze of sleep, and tried to sit up. Her body protested, aching from exhaustion, bruised from the journey, but she forced herself upright, her hands shaking as she looked around. The world beyond her had transformed. No longer was there a white wasteland of snow and ice. She lay inside a cave, warm firelight dancing on the stone walls. At first, she saw only shadows. There were shapes moving around her, the rhythmic sound of something cooking filling the air. Her baby, her precious boy, was cradled beside her, nestled in soft fur and wrapped in warm cloth. For a moment, a deep peace settled in her chest, and she allowed herself to believe that she was safe, at least a moment. Then the figure appeared, the man who had saved her. His face was partially obscured by the furs of his cloak, but his posture was unmistakable, tall, broad-shouldered, poised with a quiet strength. He turned toward her, a deep, calm gaze meeting hers. His eyes were dark, but they held no malice, no threat, only a silent curiosity, as if she were a mystery to be solved. Emily froze, the remnants of fear creeping back into her chest. The stories she had heard about the Apache echoed in her mind. Tales of ruthless warriors who slaughtered without mercy, who saw settlers as little more than prey. Her hand instinctively moved the knife tucked in her belt, but she quickly stilled it, realizing the futility of her defense. She was too weak, too vulnerable to fight. "You're awake," he said in a low voice, his words measured, deliberate, and soft. "You're safe." The words fell upon her like a strange melody, gentle but foreign. His English was broken, but clear enough for her to understand. She swallowed hard, her mouth dry, and finally spoke, her voice hoarse from both exhaustion and fear. Who are you?" He regarded her silently for a moment, the firelight catching the edges of his fur cloak, casting shadows across his strong features. His face was weathered, tanned from years spent under the sun, but there was a serenity in his expression, as though the harsh world around him had never broken his spirit. "Does it matter?" His words came quietly, without the hostility she had expected. "I am the one who found you." Emily's hand hovered near her baby, her thoughts racing. This man, this stranger, had saved her life. But why? Was he truly as kind as he seemed, or was there something more to his intentions? The fear of betrayal still lingered in her chest, an instinct born of a life where trust had been a commodity too rare to afford. I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I thought I was going to die out there." His expression softened, though his lips remained set in a firm line. "You were close," he said, his tone grave. "I could hear the wolves." Emily's breath caught in her throat. The memory of the wolves, so close, so hungry, came rushing back. She remembered the glowing eyes that circled her in the snow, the way the pack had drawn closer as she fought to keep her son warm. She had been certain she was going to die, certain that the last thing she would ever know was the cold bite of the wilderness. But this man had appeared, and suddenly everything had changed. "Thank you," she said again, the words feeling insufficient. "But who are you? Why are you helping me?" He sat down across from her, unrolling his cloak with a swift motion, revealing a well-worn bow and a quiver of arrows at his side. He didn't seem to care about her questions, but after a long silence he spoke again, his voice soft but firm. "I am Kachina," he said simply, as though his name meant everything and nothing all at once. Emily tried to sit up straighter, feeling the weight of his presence settle between them. She had heard the name before. The stories of the Apache were well known among the settlers. They were said to be fierce, unyielding, and unpredictable. But there was something in Kachina's gaze that didn't fit the image of the savage warrior she had been taught to fear. He didn't seem like the stories. His eyes spoke of loss, of wisdom born from hardship, and something softer, perhaps even kindness. She hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. Her hand found her baby once again, and she instinctively pulled him closer to her chest. Kachina's eyes flickered briefly to the child, and then back to Emily. "You have lost much," he said, his words gentle, but there was an edge of sorrow in them. "I know what it is to lose." Emily's throat tightened at the sound of his voice, the empathy she heard threading through his words. She wanted to speak, to tell him everything, to explain the emptiness she felt without Jonathan, the crushing fear of being alone in the wilderness, the uncertainty of whether she would even make it out alive. But the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't bear to recount her grief aloud. Instead, she nodded, a simple gesture that carried the weight of her emotions. Kachina rose quietly, moving toward the fire with the practiced grace of someone who had spent years living off the land. He worked with swift precision, preparing a small meal of dried meat and roots. Emily watched him, still uncertain, but something in his movements, the calmness, the decisiveness, gave her a sense of peace, a reassurance that she had made the right choice in trusting him. As he handed her a bowl of food, their fingers brushed briefly, a fleeting touch. Emily looked into his eyes, her heart still racing with unease. But there was no malice in his gaze, only a quiet understanding, a silent pact between two survivors in an unforgiving world. "Eat," he said simply. "You need strength." Emily took the bowl, her hand still trembling as she raised it to her lips. She ate slowly, savoring the warmth of food, the fire that crackled between them, and the strange, unspoken bond forming in the silence. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cave there was a fleeting moment of safety, of peace. And for the first time in days, Emily allowed herself to believe in it. She allowed herself to trust Kachina, uncertain of what the future would hold, but hopeful that for now, they might survive together. The days that followed were a blur of quiet survival. Emily slowly adapted to the strange rhythm of Kachina's world. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. Each morning, he would leave before dawn, silently slipping into the snow-covered wilderness, hunting for food or checking traps. Emily, in turn, took to the simple tasks of caring for her child, keeping the cave tidy, and learning what she could about the man who had saved her. Though their time together was marked by a tacit understanding, the distance between them remained, an invisible wall built on the distrust that clung to Emily like a second skin. She had seen too much cruelty to trust easily, and even Kachina's quiet kindness could not erase the lessons of her past. Still, with each passing day, she began to notice small things, a soft glance when she struggled with the baby, the way he always made sure she had enough food before he ate, the quiet respect he gave her without ever speaking aloud. Her baby, James, grew stronger as the days wore on, his cries less frequent, his body warming as Katchina provided not only shelter, but a sense of safety Emily had not dared hope for. Emily's nights, once filled with nightmares of cold and wolves, became a little less terrifying with Katchina nearby. She couldn't deny the comfort she found in his silent presence, though it remained tinged with ever-present unease. One morning, Katchina returned to the cave later than usual, his face drawn with fatigue. The storm had passed, but the cold lingered like a shadow. His eyes met Emily's, and in them she saw something unfamiliar. Tension, worry, something dark lurking beneath his usual calm exterior. "There are men coming," he said simply, his voice low but firm. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Her eyes widened as the implications of his words sank in. Men? Settlers? Bandits? She glanced nervously at the cave entrance, the familiar fear creeping back into her chest. "Who?" she asked, her voice shaky despite herself. "Don't know," Katchina answered, his tone neutral. He crossed the cave to the fire, kneeling beside it to warm his hands. "But I can smell their fire. They come this way." Emily's mind raced. Settlers, or worse, bandits who had no qualms about killing for what little they needed. Her first instinct was to hide, to retreat deeper into the cave and pray they didn't find her. But she couldn't risk the men discovering the baby. Her thoughts spun as she quickly surveyed their sparse shelter. There was no way they would miss the cave, not with the smoke rising from the fire Katchina had tended all morning. "Are they far?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Not far," Katchina said. "Perhaps an hour, maybe less." Panic surged in Emily's chest. An hour? That wasn't enough time. Her mind flashed back to the day she had been cast out by the settlers, how they had turned their backs on her, the way they had looked at her as though she were nothing more than a nuisance. She couldn't go back to that life, to those people, and yet she knew that they would not forgive her. Not now, not after everything that had happened. Katchina stood, his movements smooth, deliberate. "We must leave." "What about the baby?" Emily's voice cracked. "I can't just—" "I will carry him," Katchina interrupted, his tone soft but insistent. "We must go. Quickly." Emily's mind whirled. Could she trust him? Could she really leave everything behind? The harsh, lonely life she had known before seemed like a distant nightmare, one she had almost forgotten in the comfort of Katchina's presence. But there was no time to waste. The footsteps of the approaching men were getting closer. She could hear the distant crack of branches underfoot, the murmurs of voices carried faintly on the wind. Her heartbeat quickened, her thoughts scattering like birds in flight. "We go now," Katchina said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. With trembling hands, Emily gathered the few belongings she could salvage, her baby's blanket, a few scraps of dried meat, and the small knife Katchina had given her the day before. She adjusted the strap of her cloak and glanced once more at the cave, the shelter that had been her refuge. It seemed so small now, so fragile, in the face of the looming danger. Katchina led the way, moving with the practiced silence of a man who had spent his life evading danger. Emily followed close behind, the baby cradled carefully in her arms, his small body wrapped in the warmth of his makeshift blanket. The air was sharp and biting as they moved through the snow, the landscape a blur of white and gray. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their skeletal branches reaching toward the pale sky. For a time, the world was reduced to nothing but the sound of their footsteps and the wind's mournful cry. Emily tried to focus on the rhythm of her breathing, to calm the frantic pulse in her chest. But the thought of being hunted, of being forced to run from the only place that had offered her any semblance of peace, gnawed at her insides. "Why are they after us?" she asked, her voice barely audible in the howling wind. "What do they want?" Katchina's gaze was distant, focused on the path ahead. "They may not know you," he said, "but they may not care." His words hung in the air, dark with the weight of experience. Emily's mind raced, piecing together fragments of her past. The settlers, the prejudice, the rumors of her husband's disappearance. It was all connected, a web she could never untangle. They pressed on, their journey a desperate dash toward safety. Every rustle in the wind, every creak of snow beneath their feet, sent a jolt of fear through Emily's chest. She knew that with each passing minute, they grew closer to the edge, closer to discovery. Katchina's silent presence beside her offered little comfort. He was not a man of words, and his calm exterior was as much a barrier as a shield. The sound of voices grew louder. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She looked at Katchina, her face pale with fear. He nodded, as if he had expected this. "We move quickly," he urged, his voice urgent now. Without a word, they quickened their pace, the snow crunching beneath their boots as they pushed forward, deeper into the wilderness. The cold nipped at their skin, but Emily barely felt it. The only thing that mattered was the steady rhythm of their flight, the promise of survival and the hope, however fleeting, that they might escape the danger that was closing in around them. The night had fallen quickly, the pale moonlight casting long shadows over the snow-covered ground. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a desperate drum that echoed in her ears. Katchina's movements were swift, almost ghostly in their silence. He had stopped, his body still as stone, listening to the wind, the soft crunch of boots on snow. Emily dared not breathe, her own eyes searching the dark, her baby pressed tightly against her chest. The air was thick with tension, the world holding its breath. "They are near," Katchina said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Closer than I expected." The small clearing where they stood was eerily quiet, the trees around them like silent witnesses to the approaching danger. Emily's hand instinctively moved to the knife Katchina had given her, her grip trembling as her mind raced. She thought of the settlers, their cold faces, the voices that condemned her without mercy. She thought of the way they had cast her aside, as if her life had been worth nothing. The bitterness of their rejection still stung, and now, here they were, not just a threat to her, but to her son, her entire world. "We can't stay here," Emily said, her voice sharp, though fear still laced every word. Katchina didn't respond immediately. He was still, his gaze fixed on the distant line of trees. A soft breath escaped his lips, and for a moment, Emily thought she saw something in his eyes, something that wasn't just the cold calculation of a seasoned survivor. It was resolve. He had made up his mind. Without another word, he motioned for her to follow. Emily nodded quickly, understanding the unspoken command, and fell into step behind him. They moved like shadows, barely disturbing the snow, their footsteps light and quick. But the distance they had to cover seemed endless. The men were closer now, their voices a murmur on the wind, too close for comfort. Katchina's grip tightened on the bough slung across his back, the weapon a natural extension of him. Emily could feel her pulse racing in her throat. Her thoughts darted from one plan to another. Escape was a possibility, but not a certain one. The snow and trees could hide them, but for how long? And what of her baby? The wind howled, and she instinctively pulled her child closer, the warmth of his body against hers the only comfort she had left. The sound of voices grew louder. They were too close now. Emily felt a surge of panic flood her chest. "Katchina," she whispered urgently, "we have to do something." He stopped, his body a wall of stillness in the moonlight. He turned to her, his dark eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time she saw the weight of his past in them, the quiet sorrow, the scars of loss that shaped every decision he made. He was a man who had survived battles, had seen death too many times to count, yet he still stood, still fought for something. "We fight," he said simply, his voice low and steady. Emily's heart skipped a beat. "Fight!" The word felt foreign in her mouth. She had never been a fighter, not like this. She had always run from conflict, from danger, hiding in the shadows, hoping to be overlooked. But there was no escape now. Katchina moved with the grace of predator, his bow in hand, arrow nocked and ready. Emily stood frozen for a heartbeat. But the sound of the men's voices grew louder, their footsteps crunching in the snow. She snapped into action, moving to crouch beside Katchina, her mind focused on nothing but survival. The first man emerged from the trees, his face flushed from the cold, his breath coming out in heavy puffs. His eyes widened when he saw Katchina, the Apache warrior standing like a wall of iron before him. The The man's hand hovered over his rifle, but before he could raise it, Kachina's arrow flew through the air with deadly precision. The man staggered back. The shaft of the arrow lodged deep in his shoulder. He fell to the snow with a heavy grunt. A second man appeared, his rifle raised, but Kachina was already moving, fluid and fast. Another arrow flew, this one finding its mark in the man's chest, and he collapsed without a sound. The remaining 3 men hesitated, their eyes flicking from Kachina to Emily and back again. They had clearly underestimated them, had thought them easy prey. But now, they were on the defensive, unsure of how to proceed. Emily's breath caught her throat as one of the men turned toward her, his eyes narrowing with menace. She felt the icy grip of fear clutch her heart, but then something shifted in her. The sight of the man's raised rifle, the way his finger was poised to pull the trigger, snapped something inside her. She couldn't let them take her son. She couldn't let him suffer the same fate as the others who had been discarded like garbage. She moved before she even thought about it, grabbing the knife at her side and rushing toward the man. He didn't see her coming until it was too late. With a swift, desperate motion, she drove the blade deep into his side, her hands slick with blood. The man gasped, his rifle falling from his hands as he crumpled to the snow. Emily stepped back, her chest heaving, her hands trembling. Kachina was already on the move again, his bow a blur of lethal efficiency. Another man fell to the snow with an arrow lodged in his throat. The last man, terrified and wide-eyed, turned to flee, but Kachina's voice rang out in a commanding growl. "Don't run." The man froze, his body rigid with fear. Kachina stepped forward, his presence overwhelming. The man dropped his rifle, his hands raised in surrender. "We will leave," Kachina said, his voice low and dangerous. "You will not come back." The man nodded quickly, his legs shaking as he backed away into the trees, never once turning his back to the 2 of them. He vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only the sound of the wind and the distant howling of wolves. Emily stood still, her heart still racing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at Kachina, her hands still shaking, the knife heavy in her grip. For a moment, the world seemed to hang suspended, as if time had stopped. Then Kachina turned to her, his eyes softening, a silent acknowledgment passing between them. "You are stronger than you think," he said quietly. Emily's throat tightened, and for the first time since she had met him, she allowed herself to believe it. She had survived, had fought for her son, had fought for them both. And in that moment, she understood, this was the beginning of something new, not just for her, but for them both. The past, with all its pain and loss, would never fully fade. But now, in the cold stillness of the wilderness, Emily knew that she and Kachina had forged something more powerful than fear, an unspoken bond, an alliance born from necessity, yes, but also from a shared will to survive. She had come to this place broken, afraid, but now she was something more, something unbreakable. Together, they could face whatever came next.